someone told Bo Diddley to his face that he couldn't play Chuck Berry's riff. Bo Diddley picked up his guitar and proved them right in the most unexpected way anyone in that room had ever witnessed. And Chuck Berry, standing 6 feet away, didn't say a single word for what felt like a very long time. It was October 22nd, 1955, on a Saturday evening, backstage at the Regal Theater on South Michigan Avenue in Chicago, one of the most storied venues on the black entertainment circuit that ran through America's cities in that era. The Regal was a grand, ornate theater that had opened in 1928 and had hosted virtually every significant name in black American music over the preceding 3 decades. Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Muddy Waters, and dozens of others had played its stage. On this particular Saturday in 1955, the Regal was hosting a package show that placed 2 of the most talked-about figures in the new and still unnamed genre of rock and roll on the same bill for the first time in Chicago. Chuck Berry was 28 years old that evening and was riding the success of Maybelline, which had reached #1 on the rhythm and blues charts earlier that summer, and had crossed over onto the pop charts in a way that almost no song by a black artist had managed in that era. He was sharp, precise, and quietly electric, a performer who moved like he had been doing this his entire life, which in some essential way he had been. His guitar work was already something that other musicians discussed in the specific technical way that serious players discuss other serious players. Bo Diddley was 26 years old and had released his debut single, the self-titled Bo Diddley, earlier that same year on Chess Records, the same label that had signed Chuck. The single had also reached #1 on the rhythm and blues charts, making 1955 a year in which both men had achieved something that most musicians spend entire careers chasing and never find. Bo Diddley's guitar style was percussive, rhythmic, and built around a signature syncopated beat that would later bear his name and influence rock music for decades. His playing was nothing like Chuck's. It was tribal, where Chuck's was narrative, hypnotic, where Chuck's was propulsive, rooted in a different set of influences, and pointed in a different artistic direction. The 2 men were label mates, touring the same circuit, and friendly in the way that musicians who respect each other without fully understanding each other tend to be friendly, warm in passing, occasionally curious, not yet close enough to have had the more serious conversations that genuine friendship between 2 artists requires. They were, in a sense, solving different problems with the same raw materials. Both played electric guitar. Both wrote their own songs. Both were recording for Chess Records at the same time, occasionally using the same studio space and some of the same session musicians. But the music they made with all of these shared resources was so different that it was difficult to understand, from the outside, how the same instrument, the same studio, and sometimes the same rhythm section could produce results that had so little in common. Chuck's music was narrative. His songs told stories, stories with characters who had names and destinations, stories in which the guitar was a vehicle for movement, and the lyrics were the landscape the vehicle moved through. When you listened to Chuck Berry, you went somewhere. Bo Diddley's music was atmospheric. His songs created conditions rather than narratives, established a rhythmic environment so complete and insistent that the listener didn't travel anywhere. They arrived somewhere and stayed there, held in place by the rhythm, the way a drum beat holds a dancer. When you listened to Bo Diddley, you felt something rather than followed something. These were not minor differences in style. They were fundamental differences in what the artists believed music was for, expressed through every choice each of them made. The way they held their guitars, the way they used their voices, the way they structured their sets, and the way they moved on stage. Chuck moved constantly, his famous duck walk already established as one of the most distinctive pieces of performance vocabulary in rock and roll. Bo Diddley stood more still, letting the rhythm do the moving, His rectangular guitar held at a slight angle that was as immediately recognizable as his beat. The backstage area at the Regal Theater that Saturday evening was crowded in the way that package show backstages always were. Multiple acts, multiple managers, musicians warming up in corners, dressers moving between dressing rooms, a house photographer documenting the evening for promotional use. The air smelled of hair oil, cigarette smoke, and the particular blend of nervous energy and professional calm that experienced performers carry backstage at major venues. Earl Copeland, the Regal stage manager, moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been managing complex backstage logistics for 12 years and had developed an almost architectural understanding of how to keep people and equipment moving in a small space without collision. Among the people in the backstage area that night was a promoter named Marcus DeWitt, a sharp-dressed 38-year-old Chicago man who had been running package shows through the Midwest for nearly a decade and who had a personality that functioned equally well as social lubricant and as occasional accelerant. Marcus knew everyone on the circuit, was liked by most of them, had a reputation for paying on time and treating musicians professionally that made him welcome in backstage spaces that some promoters were quietly discouraged from entering, and had a gift for the kind of remark that seemed harmless until it had already set something in motion. Marcus DeWitt had been watching Chuck Berry run through a brief sound check earlier that evening, during which Chuck had played the opening guitar riff of Maybelline 3 times in rapid succession while a sound engineer adjusted the monitor levels. The riff was already famous enough that people backstage had turned to watch when they heard it, because there was something about those opening notes that triggered recognition in anyone who had heard the record. And recognition in music creates a particular kind of attention that cuts through everything else happening in a room. Marcus had been standing near Bo Diddley during this sound check, close enough to observe Bo's reaction to the riff, and after Chuck finished and stepped away from the monitor position and back toward his dressing room, Marcus turned to Bo and said in the half-serious, half-joking tone he used for most of his provocative observations, that Chuck's guitar style was its own specific thing, and that not everybody could do what Chuck did with a rhythm guitar, even people who were excellent guitarists in their own right. He said this without quite meaning it as a challenge, and yet it landed as a challenge, because Marcus DeWitt's remarks had a way of landing wherever they needed to land to produce the most interesting outcome. Bo Diddley, who had a personality that did not easily accept the suggestion that he was unable to do something a fellow guitarist could do, responded by suggesting that the riff wasn't complicated and that any competent player could replicate it. Marcus then said the thing that set the evening in a different direction. He said, still in that same half-serious tone, "I'd like to see you play it the way Chuck plays it. I don't think you can." The people standing nearby heard this. Chuck Berry, who had not yet moved far from the monitor position and was speaking with one of his band members, heard it too. The room did not stop moving, but certain conversations within it paused in the way conversations pause when something has been said that raises the possibility of something interesting about to happen. Bo Diddley set down the drink he was holding. He picked up his guitar from the stand beside him, his rectangular Gretsch Jupiter Thunderbird that was as distinctive in its appearance as his playing was in its sound. He looked at Marcus DeWitt with the expression of a man who is about to demonstrate something rather than argue about it. "Play it for me," Bo said to Chuck. Chuck Berry turned fully toward Bo, assessed the situation in the quick, complete way he assessed most situations, and understood immediately what was being asked. He picked up his own guitar, his Gibson ES-350T, and played the opening riff of Maybelline cleanly, at medium tempo, without showing off or adding anything extra. He played it the way he played it on the record, economical, rhythmically precise, every note earning its position in the phrase. The riff was deceptive in the way that the most well-designed musical phrases often are. It sounded simple. It was, in technical terms, not complex. The notes themselves were not difficult to find on a guitar neck. and a competent player who had been playing for a few years could locate all of them within a few minutes of attempting the phrase. What was difficult was the execution, the particular angle of attack on the strings that Chuck used, the specific relationship between his pick and the frets that created a tone that was bright without being harsh, the rhythmic precision that made the phrase feel like it was moving faster than it actually was, the exact amount of forward lean in the tempo that gave the riff its sense of urgency without making it sound rushed. And something harder to name than any of those technical elements, a quality of intention in the playing that made the notes sound like they were going somewhere specific, rather than simply being produced in sequence. The riff sounded like the beginning of something, not a musical exercise, not a demonstration. Bo Diddley listened to Chuck play the riff twice. He had his own way of listening to guitar players, not passively, but with the focused, evaluating attention of someone assessing a technique they might borrow or a problem they might solve. He watched Chuck's hands. He tracked the motion of the pick. He noted the body position and the position of the guitar neck. He was doing in real time what skilled musicians do when they are confronted with another skilled musician's work, breaking it down into its constituent parts in order to understand how it was constructed. What came out was technically accurate. Bo found every note, executed the rhythm correctly, and produced a version of the riff that was recognizable and competent. Any musician in the room would have confirmed that Bo Diddley had just played the opening riff of Maybelline correctly. But something was different, and everyone in the room heard it. Not everyone could have named what they heard, but they heard it. The notes were right. The rhythm was right. The riff was there. And it sounded like Bo Diddley playing Chuck Berry's riff, which is to say, it sounded like a version of the thing, rather than the thing itself. The way a translation of a poem contains all the correct words and none of the original music. Bo Diddley heard it too. He stopped. He played the riff again, adjusting something in his picking hand, trying a different attack angle. It came out closer, but still not quite the same. He tried it a third time, with a different approach to the rhythm, and the phrase moved in a direction that was interesting in its own right, but was clearly Bo Diddley's version of the riff, rather than what Chuck Berry had just played 6 feet away. Bo set his Gretsch down on its stand and was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised everyone in the room, including Marcus DeWitt, who had started all of this with his half-serious remark. "I can't play that riff," Bo Diddley said. He said it plainly, without embarrassment, without qualification. "I can play my version of it, but I can't play it the way you play it." He looked at Chuck Berry when he said this. Chuck had not moved, had not spoken, had been watching Bo's 3 attempts with the same attentive, unreadable expression he used for most things that interested him. Chuck was quiet for a moment after Bo spoke. Then he said something that nobody in the room had expected him to say. "I can't play yours either," Chuck said. Bo Diddley looked at him. "Play the Bo Diddley beat," Chuck said. "The one from your record. I want to try it." Bo picked up his guitar again and played the signature syncopated rhythm pattern that had made his debut single so distinctive and recognizable. He played it for about 8 bars, settling into the groove that seemed to come from some internal engine rather than from deliberate technique. Chuck listened for all 8 bars. Then he picked up his own guitar and attempted the Bo Diddley beat. It came out wrong in a way that was illuminating rather than embarrassing. Chuck's version of Bo's beat was technically correct in terms of the note values and the basic rhythmic structure, but it didn't groove. It didn't have the particular sway that Bo's version had, the way Bo's beat seemed to pull slightly behind and ahead of the pulse at the same time, creating a tension that made the rhythm feel alive rather than mechanical. Chuck's version was a competent musician's rendering of a pattern. Bo's version was something generated from a source that couldn't be fully accessed from the outside. Chuck stopped playing and nodded slowly. "We're doing 2 different things," Chuck said. It was not a complaint or a concession. It was an observation delivered in the tone of someone who has just had a useful piece of information confirmed. Marcus DeWitt, who had started this entire sequence of events with a half-serious provocation, had gone quiet and had not said anything further for the preceding several minutes. He said afterward, to people who asked him about the evening, that what he witnessed between Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley in the backstage area of the Regal Theater that October night was one of the most interesting musical exchanges he had ever seen, not because either musician had failed, but because both of them had discovered, through direct and unsentimental experiment, exactly where the boundary of their particular gifts ended and where someone else's began. Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley went on to share dozens of bills over the following years, and their friendship deepened into one of the more substantive relationships either man had in the music industry. A friendship built on the kind of mutual respect that can only exist between two people who have been genuinely honest with each other about something that mattered. They were not the kind of friends who spoke often or at great length. They were the kind of friends who, when they were in the same room, communicated in a register that didn't require many words, because the meaningful exchange between them had already happened in that backstage space at the Regal Theater in October of 1955. And everything that came after it was built on that foundation. Neither of them ever claimed to be able to play the other's specific sound. Both of them understood, after that October evening, that the attempt to do so wasn't a failure. It was simply a confirmation of something that serious musicians spend their entire careers learning. The thing that makes a great player great is precisely the thing that cannot be transferred, imitated, or borrowed, no matter how technically capable the imitator happens to be. This is not a comforting fact for young musicians who believe that if they study hard enough and practice long enough, they can eventually do what their heroes do. But it is an honest one, and the musicians who accept it soonest are almost always the ones who develop most quickly, because the acceptance of that fact frees them to find the uncopyable thing inside their own playing, rather than spending their energy trying to reproduce someone else's. Marcus DeWitt told the story for the rest of his life, typically using it as a caution against the easy assumption that one musician's style can be reproduced by another simply because the notes are the same. He refined the story over the years, as people do with stories they tell often, but the core never changed. Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley showed him in about 15 minutes something that most people in the music business spend decades pretending isn't true, which is that the deepest part of what a musician does lives below any level of technique that another musician can consciously reach. He said that the most interesting moment of the evening was not when Bo Diddley admitted he couldn't play Chuck's riff. It was when Chuck Berry picked up his guitar and admitted he couldn't play Bo's, because Chuck Berry didn't have to do that. Nobody had asked him to. He did it because the conversation required it, and because the honest answer to what Marcus DeWitt had started with his half-serious provocation was not a winner and a loser. It was two men discovering the precise location of what made each of them irreplaceable. The Regal Theater's stage manager, Earl Copeland, noted in his October 22, 1955 journal entry that Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley had compared guitar techniques backstage before the show, and that both men had appeared thoughtful afterward, not animated in the way musicians typically appear after a competition, but settled, as if something had been resolved rather than contested. In 12 years of watching musicians prepare for performances at the Regal, Earl Copeland had developed an understanding of the difference between those two states. The musicians who came off stage or out of backstage exchanges looking animated had usually confirmed something they already believed. The musicians who came out looking settled had usually learned something new. Chuck Berry and Bo Diddley both played their full sets that evening at the Regal Theater, to the enthusiastic response that the Regal's audiences gave to musicians they recognized as genuinely exceptional. What the audience heard that night, without knowing any of what had occurred behind the heavy curtain of the backstage area 40 minutes earlier, was two men performing from the exact center of what they were, which is perhaps the truest and most complete way any musician can perform, and which is the thing that audiences feel even when they cannot name it, and which is why the music from that era still sounds, to anyone who listens carefully, like something that came from an irreplaceable source. If this incredible story of two legends discovering the uncopyable thing at the center of each other's genius moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with anyone who plays an instrument or loves music and knows what it means to try to do something someone else does naturally, only to discover that the gap between technique and soul is not something practice alone can close. Have you ever tried to imitate a musician you love and found something surprising on the other side of the attempt? Tell us about it in the comments and ring that notification bell, because the most important conversations in music history happened not on stages, but in the rooms behind them.